Did you know that the Allies had to fight their way through the French in order to attack the Germans?
There's someone else up there we can talk to?
No, now go away or I shall taunt you a second time.
Hello, you fine folks. Today we're talking about what was basically the JV version of D-Day, Operation Torch. Operation Torch was the first major offensive against the Germans involving the US, and it saw a force of over 100,000 troops land on various North African beaches in 1942. This was no small endeavor, and it was an important development in the war that is often overlooked today. So join me, and we will explore the what and the why of this operation. To explain the why, we need to go back to early 1941, before America was even officially involved in the war. From January to March of that year, the top military brass of the United States and Britain secretly convened in Washington, D.C. in what was designated the ABC Conference. Their purpose was to prepare a combined military strategy for the event that America entered the war. Both nations agreed that Germany was a greater threat than Japan or Italy, so the doctrine of Germany first was adopted, meaning that primary effort would go toward winning the war in Europe before turning to the Pacific if necessary. At the end of that year, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and Germany and Italy declared war on the US a few days later, drawing America into the global conflict. With America now officially involved, the Allies began meeting regularly to discuss their plans for the war. It quickly became apparent that the US and Britain had very different perspectives. On the part of the US, Roosevelt had many influences pushing him towards an early invasion of France. For one, the Germany first policy meant that the Pacific would be a defensive game for now, but the US population needed to see some sort of deployment in 1942 to keep up morale. For another, Roosevelt's military advisors, such as General George C. Marshall, firmly believed that an invasion directly on the European continent was the fastest way to victory. And thirdly, Roosevelt had promised Stalin that he would open up a second front in Europe to take the pressure off the beleaguered Russians. Britain, however, understood that Germany was well entrenched in Northern Europe and believed that an early invasion there would simply be impossible. The Brits were also quite cautious after the First World War and preferred a strategy of making indirect attacks on Germany's periphery, like a boxer making light jabs to wear down an opponent. Further, Britain had imperial interest in the Mediterranean that they wanted to preserve, and all of these factors coalesced into Winston Churchill's staunch objection to a 1942 invasion of France. After months of butting heads over this, something of a compromise was reached that heavily favored the British strategy. An invasion of North Africa would take place at the end of 1942, dubbed Operation Torch, with provision made for an eventual invasion of Europe across the English Channel, which would evolve into Operation Overlord. Since Churchill got his way with Torch, he was happy to concede operational command to an American, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Allied Commander in the summer of 1942. With Operation Torch scheduled for November 8th, Eisenhower only had a few months to coordinate what was at the time the most complicated military operation in US history. Taking the edge off with up to 4 packs of cigarettes per day, Eisenhower set to work with a staff of American and British officers to prepare for Torch. Casually known as Ike, Eisenhower had a calm and charming personality that proved invaluable in managing his multinational staff. In hindsight, his service in this role was providential, as he was determined to mitigate nationality and promote the unity of an Allied war effort. This was vital in making the Allied relationship work, as it helped reconcile the brash boldness of the Americans with the meticulous caution of the British. If the two nations had been unable to work together for Torch, the much more complicated Operation Overlord would have been a disaster, and who knows how the war may have gone. Now, while it was settled that the invasion would be into North Africa, there was still the matter of choosing a specific landing site. The British wanted to land as far inside the Mediterranean as possible to allow a swift attack upon Tunisia, but the Americans were wary of exposing their flank to Spain and wanted to land on the Atlantic coast. A compromise was made. 3 different task forces would be assembled and would land at 3 different areas. The Western Task Force would consist entirely of Americans and would land 35,000 troops near Casablanca under the command of General George Patton. Commanded by Major General Lloyd R. Fredendall, the Center Task Force would be made up of 39,000 US troops and a British naval escort and would land at Oran. Finally, consisting of 23,000 British and 10,000 American troops and a fully British naval unit, the Eastern Task Force would land at Algiers under Major General Charles Ryder. The Western Task Force would sail directly from the US, but the Center and Eastern Task Forces traveled south from England. The Allies had assembled a fleet of landing craft like early LSTs and Higgins boats, and these transports would make the amphibious operation possible. successful, but the great unknown in the operation would be the reception of the French. France's status was complicated. It had fallen early in the war to be rechristened the neutral power Vichy France and had adopted a policy of collaboration with the Germans. Many French were disgusted by this and either operated a resistance or simply harbored anti-German sentiment, but many French also felt honor-bound to respect their new government and defend their territories. Additionally, France largely felt abandoned by the British after Dunkirk and nursed a sense of betrayal after the British opened fire on the French fleet in July of 1940, which is a video for another day, but you should really look that up because it's just crazy.
It's quite cool.
All this to say, the landings of Operation Torch took place on the shores of French Morocco and French Algeria, and the Allies were unsure if the French would greet them as liberators or as invaders. To improve their chances, the Allies tried to contact local French leaders that they thought would be sympathetic, and even sent US General Mark Clark on a submarine to covertly meet with French General Charles Mast. While the meeting was technically successful, General Clark was unable to provide a specific time or location of the landings to the French general due to operational security. As such, most of the sympathetic French were just as surprised and unprepared as everyone else when the Allies began their landings in the early hours of November 8th. In the West, the Western Task Force split widely to land at 3 different sites: Safi, Fadala, and Port Lyautey. The Americans achieved great surprise here, and while they dealt with resistance from the French fleet, the beaches themselves were unopposed. The real issue the Americans encountered here was with their landing craft. For one, the landings occurred so early in the morning that many coxswains became disoriented and delivered the troops far from the intended beach. 2 boats even got so lost that they traveled directly into the Casablanca harbor and tried asking a French patrol boat for directions.
Do you know the way?
The French vessel promptly fired upon and sank both boats, taking all the survivors as prisoners. On top of this, the ocean waters were much fiercer than anticipated. The waves wildly tossed about the small Higgins boats, often damaging both them and their passengers, and some soldiers even drowned in the shallow surf when they tried to wade to shore in heavy gear. After the troops had finally made it to shore and collected themselves, the early morning light began to betray their arrival. The French proceeded to coordinate a defense, and it wasn't until 2 days later, on November 10th, that the defenders finally received orders to stand down. The landings at Oran saw a worse reception. Surprise was not nearly achieved, and a gambit to rush 2 commando-filled corvettes into the harbor resulted in the destruction of both vessels, and an 88% casualty rate for the commandos. The US 1st Ranger Battalion succeeded in landing to the east of Oran and captured a shore battery, but it took over 2 days of naval bombardment by British warships before the French surrendered to the Center Task Force. To the east at Algiers, the British Navy faced a similar reception as Oran, but sustained less casualties. Allied troops also encountered a mix of receptions from the French. Some had to deal with fierce resistance and house-to-house fighting, but others came across Frenchmen staging coups and attempting to welcome the Allies. In addition to the beach landings, the Allies also launched their first ever large-scale airborne operation. The US 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment was flown all the way from England to drop at strategic points at the beginning of Torch. This was a 1,500-mile trip, and the 39 C-47s flying the mission encountered bad weather and enemy fire, and only 10 planes ended up airdropping their troops. Overall, the landings were successful, and the Allies eventually achieved the cooperation of French officers such as François Darlan. Throughout this endeavor, the Allies had worked together and learned valuable lessons that would help them eventually execute Operation Overlord a year and a half later. They were now taking the fight directly to Axis forces in North Africa, which would eventually lead to invasions of both Sicily and Italy. At the same time, far to the northeast, the Russians were beginning a counteroffensive to push the Germans out of Stalingrad. And in the Pacific, the US was taking the fight to the Japanese with the Guadalcanal campaign. The tide of the war was officially changing. And that concludes our exploration of Operation Torch. We're getting close to the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and next week I will be doing a breakdown of all the different types of landing craft used on D-Day. It should be fun. If this video is worth your time, don't forget to like and do the subscribe so you stay tuned in for all future vids. I'll see you guys in the next video. Ruibas out.